VCY America presents Crosstalk, a nationwide call-in program discussing issues that have an effect on our families, our communities, our churches, our nation, and our world. Crosstalk, an opportunity for you to voice your concerns for biblical principles. And now live by satellite and around the world on the internet at vcyamerica.org. Here is today's Crosstalk.
Well, welcome to Crosstalk on the VCY America Network. My name is Jim Schneider. We thank you for joining us today as we really take a look at some of the current issues that are going on. Sometimes it's taking place in a particular state or in our nation as a whole, but certainly they impact all of us in some way. And there's been a whole lot of debate and discussion going on regarding the matter of immigration reform and the controversy that surrounds this measure that is being taken. Is it amnesty? Is it not? What is its impact? We're going to be delving into these issues today. It's our privilege to have with us Dr. Stephen Camarota, who serves as the Director of Research for the Center for Immigration Studies. They're a Washington, D.C.-based research institute that examines the consequences of legal and illegal immigration on the United States. Stephen has testified before Congress more than any other non-government expert on the economic and fiscal impact of immigration. And Dr. Stephen Camarota, thank you for joining us today on Crosstalk.
Well, thank you for having me.
Stephen, for years we have heard of the need for immigration reform. I mean, that's been the buzz. Most often that references dealing with the reform of how do we deal with this matter of immigration in our country. And the focus is primarily on the illegal immigrants, the illegal aliens that have entered our borders. Let's talk first of all as to how porous are our borders at this time.
Well, in some areas, it's obviously the border is stronger, but it looks like maybe half the people, based on some recent satellite and radar analysis of the border, still maybe half the people who try to get in successfully cross our border illegally. We're not 100% sure of that, but the border's still not secure. The second thing, remember, is upwards of 40% of all illegal immigrants in the United States are people who came in on temporary visas and just never went home. They didn't honor the time limit. So they were guest workers, foreign students, tourists, and perhaps 1 million people came in on border crossing cards that we've issued in Mexico, and then those people just never went home.
Whatever happened to the so-called fence between the U.S. and Mexican border? I mean, didn't President Bush sign back in 2006 a law to create such a fence for our southern border?
Right. I mean, this is a great example of why, not just skepticism, but cynicism is the appropriate position to take on immigration when you hear promises of future enforcement. We didn't build it. We built parts of it. We built some barriers. It depends on what you consider a fence, a vehicle barrier, like the kind that you see in the movies that was at Normandy during World War II. So you can't drive a vehicle across the border, and that's actually very important, but it doesn't stop people. And in other places, they've decided to go with a virtual fence to alert them, but unfortunately that hasn't worked out. So there is more border, both regular fence and barriers, but there are lots of parts of the border that we thought were going to have a physical fence that don't.
I'd like to also look at kind of the impact that illegal immigration is having on our country, and I've got several areas here. If you could just comment as to how we're impacted. Right away, I've got some things that come to my mind, and one of those is jobs. How are jobs impacted?
Right. Well, the good news is the vast majority of Americans don't face job competition from illegal immigrants. Illegal immigrants are overwhelmingly unskilled. We think a majority haven't graduated high school. We think that maybe another 25% have only a high school education, and most Americans are more educated. So that's the good news. The bad news is the Americans who do face the job competition from illegal immigrants do tend to be the poorest or the least among us, if you will. For example, high school dropouts only make up about 8% of workers in the United States, native-born. But they make up about 20% of the working poor. And about a quarter of all the children of the working poor are dependent on a high school dropout for income, a working high school dropout. So in that way, you could see how the effect can be very concentrated on only a modest part of U.S. workers face the competition. On the other hand, those that do really are the worst off to begin with.
Now, I understand that the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights actually wrote the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus on this matter. What did they say?
What they basically pointed out is the terrible employment situation that less educated and young African Americans face: unemployment, non-work, low wages. the situation, say, for blacks under the age of 30 who don't have a high school education or have only a high school education is really bad. And the point there is that that group has just not been given adequate weight in this debate. In fact, that I think is one of the big criticisms you can make generally. The Schumer-Rubio amnesty bill, or whatever we're going to call it, it basically, they met with lots of interest groups, but not the people who face the job competition from illegals or from these big increases in legal immigration incorporated in the bill. Those people just they weren't part of it. So we have over 100,000 unemployed maids, or we have over 100,000 unemployed house painters, and over 100 more than that in terms of construction laborers. Those people were just not part of the formulation of this policy.
What about social services? What impact does illegal immigration have on the social services in our nation?
Well, certain key areas tend to get heavily impacted. Public education is one. We probably are spending somewhere around $40 billion a year educating about 4 million children that come from illegal immigrant families. The Supreme Court ruled that states couldn't bar these kids from public schools, and you can understand that. Congress may be able to, but the court said the states couldn't do it. Other areas, illegal immigrants probably make up nearly 20% of the people without health insurance, so they certainly cost a lot in that area. Illegal immigrants are mostly younger and healthier, so they're not as likely to need health care as sort of the general population. Nonetheless, when you have the majority of illegals are uninsured, and they make up a very large share of the uninsured. Illegal immigrants and their kids are about 5% of the total population, but close to 20% of the uninsured. You can see that that's a very big impact on emergency rooms and hospitals, and that's another big area. The thing to remember about illegals when you think about the fiscal cost, taxes paid versus services used, is that it basically reflects the educational attainment that I mentioned at the outset. Illegal immigrants are overwhelmingly unskilled. The overwhelming share have no education beyond high school, and people with that skill profile in the modern American economy just don't make that much. And so even when they're paid on the books, they don't pay that much in taxes. At the same time, their low income often makes them, or more likely their U.S.-born children, eligible for a host of public services. And so that's really the challenge. In effect, it's you can't bring in or allow to stay lots of unskilled people without sort of kicking taxpayers in the teeth. If you will, there's a high cost to cheap labor if you had to put it in a bumper sticker. And so that's the reality. But keep in mind, your listeners need to understand, yes, a large fraction of illegal immigrant households receive some form of welfare, but that's not because those households don't work. The vast majority of those households have a worker in them, but given the educational attainment of that worker and resulting income, the children still qualify for lots of social services.
Yeah, and there's been a big push for food stamps as of recent, too.
That's right. Here's the funny thing. This might be a way to think about this issue. It may seem like it's contradictory, but it's not. Immigrants generally have high labor force participation. That is, they mostly work at relatively high rates. So what that tells us is there's a really good network within immigrant communities helping to connect workers with jobs. At the same time, there's also a really good network, and a lot of expertise have been built up in immigrant communities about how to access the welfare system. So in the same way, lots of immigrants work, and lots of immigrants have their kids on Medicaid. Lots of immigrants have their kids signed up for WIC. Lots of kids have their kids signed up for free school lunch and so forth. So you would think that high rates of work would mean very low rates of welfare, but it turns out that's just not the case.
Okay, so we've looked briefly here at the educational system, social services, jobs. What about matters pertaining to crime and law enforcement?
I have a whole report on that very issue, or partly on that issue, and I title it Assessing a Conflicted Issue. Immigration and crime is a tough one. There are places where the data support the idea that the immigrants commit a disproportional share of crime, arrests, incarceration, but there are other areas where that does not seem to be the case. So it's hard to say. Yes, there's lots of, it's a population of 11 million people, so there are tens of thousands of illegal immigrant criminals in the United States, but that doesn't mean that illegal immigrants are committing a disproportionate share of crime. They might, but I don't think we know that for sure. What we do know is that there is, if you will, a kind of pervasive violation of the law, whether it's tax law or identity fraud or perjury on federal documents for identity, that is associated with illegal immigration. That kind of violation of law is very common. And it is true that when we talk about gang activity, illegal immigrants do seem to be disproportionately associated with gang activity.
Do you believe that amnesty in all of this favors non-citizens at the expense of citizens?
Well, it's certainly true that if you give legal status to everyone here who's here illegally, it makes everyone who played by the rules and followed the immigration system, all the legal immigrants, it does make them look like fools and dupes. It makes them look like saps, if you will, for having taken the rules seriously. And that is very troubling. And it does seem that when, say, Senator Rubio talks about this, he shows a lot of Christian empathy for the illegal immigrants themselves, and I think it's sincere, and I think it's understandable, and maybe he's right. But he never mentions the Americans who will continue to face the job competition if the illegals are allowed to stay. He never mentions the Americans who have to face the overcrowded schools that illegal immigrants create. He never mentions them. There are other people here who are often the least among us, and they don't seem to enter into his calculation.
Yeah, and there's also something else called the rule of law that needs to mix into all this, doesn't it?
Right. I mean, his position is, look, we can't enforce the law, therefore we have to accept that reality and give legal status to all the illegal immigrants. What the more realistic way of putting it is, we've chosen not to enforce the law, and we choose continually not to enforce the law at the border, at the work site, at the airports and entry and ports of entry. We've made a decision not to enforce the law. This isn't the weather. This isn't written in stone by the hand of God. We have made a conscious, willful decision not to enforce the law, and what he is saying and others is we now have to give the people who violated the law what they want, that is to stay in the United States. That may be true, but it is a slap in the face to the law-abiding. There's just no question about it.
We're speaking today with Dr. Stephen Camarota from the Center for Immigration Studies. With Congress, they're on break right now, but are going to be reconvening shortly. And leading up to this break, there was just a whole lot of activity on this area of immigration reform and the so-called Gang of Eight and their compromise legislation that they've drafted. If you would explain for us exactly what it is that is being proposed by this Gang of Eight, the compromise legislation that's being purported.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that much of a compromise. Basically, all the people who want very expansive immigration and legalization for the illegal immigrants got what they wanted. They made a deal amongst themselves. So what the bill basically says is that after it's passed, Department of Homeland Security has to submit a plan that says how they're going to secure the border. They don't have to actually secure the border. The plan may never be implemented, but they have to submit a plan. So they have to staple some pages together and have some typing on it, and they send that in. And then the illegal immigrants get their legal status, jobs, Social Security numbers, and so forth. And there are other parts of it, and maybe I can talk about them after the break.
You're listening to Crosstalk here on VCY America with Dr. Stephen Camarota as our guest as we talk about the immigration reform controversy. Later in the program, we'll give you opportunity to interact as well. You're listening to Crosstalk on VCY America.
Back to Genesis with Dr. John Morris, Creation Seminar speaker with the Institute for Creation Research. Dr. Morris, what does the Bible have to say about dinosaurs?
Chris, the Bible gives us a good bit of information about dinosaurs. Of course, it doesn't use the rather new term dinosaur, but it does use the term dragon for great reptilian beast. Some of their descriptions sound an awful lot like dinosaurs. These great beasts were created perfect in the beginning, but when Adam sinned, the whole creation was cursed, including the dinosaurs. Soon the whole world was destroyed by Noah's flood, yet 2 of each dinosaur kind were on board Noah's Ark. Most or all of them eventually went extinct, but there's a great deal of evidence that humans and dinosaurs lived together in fairly recent times. They weren't just imagined, they were real. We can piece together how to think about the dinosaurs only by starting back in Genesis.
For more on Genesis, visit our website at icr.org. This is Chris O'Brien. Thanks for going back to Genesis.
You're listening to Crosstalk here on the VCY America Network. Our guest today, Dr. Stephen Camarota, the Director of Research for the Center for Immigration Studies. They're based in Washington, D.C. They examine the consequences of both legal and illegal immigration on the U.S. We're focusing in on the immigration reform package, which really seems to be enshrouded around the topic of the illegal immigration that's been going on. Our guest today has testified many times before Congress on this issue. And Stephen, you were talking here before the break about this Gang of Eight, this so-called compromise legislation, and the Department of Homeland Security having to submit a plan, whether they implement it or not. I mean, that's just what kind of confidence does this give to the American people as far as just the submission of a plan with no real enforcement as having to carry out the plan? I mean, we don't even know what that plan is.
Well, if it's possible, they should have less than zero confidence. Experience suggests that promises of future enforcement of immigration laws are not worth the paper that they're printed on. I could explain why that is, but I think the public gets that basic fact. The law is largely unenforced as a conscious choice that we've made. What this bill does is promise more enforcement, but it's amnesty first, or legalization first, if you like that term better, with the promise of future enforcement. Once the bill goes into effect and that plan gets submitted, and again, nothing else has to happen, the illegal immigrants get work authorization, Social Security numbers, driver's licenses, the ability to travel to and from the United States. Now, they do have to wait about 10 years before they can start to get their green card. That is permanent residency. But in terms of legal status, not getting deported, and just about everything else that a green card gives you, you get that on day one. Then you have to wait a few more years if you want citizenship. It's not clear that people even want citizenship. It's not clear they even want the green card. But most everybody wants legal status, and that's what they get on the first day. Now, there are some things that have to be done in terms of enforcement, maybe, to get to that green card level. But if they're never done, it looks as if they still automatically get their green cards. Besides, the head of Homeland Security can waive all that stuff as well. There's so many waivers in the bill that everything that looks like a requirement isn't, and everything that looks like a requirement can be waived anyway.
Tell us about the size of this legislation.
Yeah, it's about 844 pages long. In terms of the number of words, it's about 75% as long as the New Testament. So basically, they're being asked to read and digest this thing, and vote on it in just a couple of weeks. It's absurd. It's just like Obamacare. It's got a million details, an infinite number of implications for American society, and the idea that we're just going to put it all together and vote on it, and I guess we find out what's in the bill after we vote on it.
Yeah, we've been through that one before. Stephen, let's. I heard you use the word amnesty, and that's been the hub of debate over this thing. Many have declared this compromise legislation as amnesty. The Marco Rubios out there say, no, it's not. It's not. I'm opposed to amnesty. You use the word amnesty. Is it?
Well, let me answer it this way. There are lots of amnesties in the United States every day. Just Google it. You'll find it immediately. And I've done this, and I wrote a little paper on it. But there are lots of times when a city or state has what's called a tax amnesty. What a tax amnesty is you have to pay the original tax. Typically, you have to pay some fines, part of the interest, but we'll waive the civil penalties and we'll waive the part of the fines. They do parking ticket amnesties. Everyone calls them amnesties. You have to pay the original ticket and then maybe the second tier fines, but the third tier fines or any other penalties, we waive that. In other words, there are dozens in the last 10 years of parking ticket and tax amnesties that do this. They put aside the normal penalty, but there's still requirements. You have to meet them. You have to have the ticket has to be between a certain amount of time, or the taxes have to be a certain amount. And so there are requirements. You have to pay a penalty, including you have to pay something, the original fine, typically additional penalties and so forth. But they waive part of the penalty. The normal penalty is put aside. What this amnesty does, the immigration amnesty, is put aside the normal penalty for being in America illegally, which is you got to go home. That's the normal penalty. We put that aside, and we instead say you have to pay a $500 fine and undergo about a background check. That's what happens. The normal penalty is put aside. Now, let me just add that it's unambiguously an amnesty, in areas like whether you use document fraud. If you've stolen someone else's ID to work in the United States, the bill's clear. You get a pass on that.
Wow.
If you have, and that's true of a lot of illegal immigrants, obviously. If you've committed fraud against the federal government, you signed an I-9 form, which is that form that we all sign when we get a job,
right,
and say, yes, I attest this is my name and Social Security number, and I'm authorized to work in the United States. Here's a copy of my driver's license. If you sign that and you weren't authorized to work in the United States, you've committed fraud. You get a complete pass on that. So the bill is an amnesty, not just because of those explicit amnesty provisions, but it takes the form of all other amnesties as well, which is the normal penalty is set aside, but there's still some penalty, and we still make you pay, a fine and so forth. Or put a different way, if this isn't an amnesty, then all those parking tickets, dozens of them, and tax amnesties in the last decade or 2 decades weren't amnesties either. But everyone called them amnesties. The enabling legislation calls them amnesties. The only reason this is not being called an amnesty is marketing. Only politicians, it seems, can be this disingenuous with this level of sincerity. But I guess that's one of the things that defines politicians.
And this is a story that is not going out through the nightly newscast. I mean, this is a story that people need to hear as what this legislation is really all about. U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder, April 24th, gave this speech to the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Education Fund Awards Gala that he said, creating a mechanism to earn citizenship and move out of the shadows is a matter of civil and human rights. He said the federal government will work hard to safeguard the rights of language minorities. Now, do people from anywhere in the world have a right to come and live in the United States?
No, and if you'd like to go to our website, actually, we have some biblical scholars who point out all the incidents in the Bible where people had to respect borders, including Moses himself, when asked, to pass through certain kingdoms. He was explicitly asked, they said no, and he went around. He respected borders. He respected that. There's a long tradition in the Old Testament of respecting what we would interpret today as migration or immigration rules. In any event, no, it's absurd. And the UN Declaration on human rights, the Supreme Court of the United States, the Constitution, none of these things recognize a right for you to live in another country if that other country says no. There is no recognized right to. You may have a right to leave your country if you don't like it, but no one has the right to say, I can go live anywhere I want in someone else's country. So to suggest that is a kind of a violation of just sort of the basic sovereignty of the United States, and to have a public official do that is very disconcerting.
Especially the U.S. Attorney General.
The person who's the top law enforcement official in the country.
He also used this term language minorities, and that sounded rather peculiar to me. Can you define what's he meaning by language minorities?
Well, this is something that's evolved since the 1960s, not surprisingly, that if you don't speak English, you're entitled to certain protections, including things like have voting ballots printed up in your language. Now, of course, a moment's reflection basically reveals that makes no sense. Because when you naturalize, when a legal immigrant becomes a full citizen of the United States, they have to display a knowledge of English. So they should be able to read English. And people born in the United States should also be able to have learned English. They lived here. They grew up here. So who exactly are these foreign language ballots for? Well, what it's for is to preserve ethnic identity. And unfortunately, there's a whole industry designed to balkanize the country and remind people of their backgrounds and ethnicity and their race. And this, there's a lot of what you might call professional ethnics out there whose job it is to keep the country divided. Because if people assimilate, well, then they have no one they can claim to represent. And that's one of the downsides of immigration in modern America, the identity and grievance politics.
I'd like to question you on another aspect here of Holder's statement. He also said it's a long past time to reform our immigration system in a way that is fair, that guarantees that all are playing by the same rules. Now, what about this comment about the same rules? I mean, here the rule book is being thrown out the window. We have the rules already in law, but how is it that we have those who are illegally playing the game and those who are legally playing the game? How do we bring those two factions together here?
Yeah, I guess from his point of view is that, if you're illegally in the United States, you're being exploited, and we need to stop doing that. And if you abided by the rules, then you're just a sap. You're a sucker who took us at our word and obeyed the law. And unfortunately, that's the end result of any amnesty. It makes everyone who played by the rules look very foolish indeed.
Phyllis Schlafly from Eagle Forum, she wrote a column that said amnesty equals suicide for the Republican Party. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, right. I mean, there's no question, and this is more even true of legal immigration generally, that all the polling we have show that the immigrants who arrive are overwhelmingly attracted to the Democratic Party because of that party's economic positions. So, for example, the Pew Hispanic Center found in a poll when asked people, would you like a government that spends more and does more, or a government that spends less and does less? 75% of Hispanics said they wanted a government that does more and spends more. When they asked people, the Pew Research Center did a poll asking people about their attitudes towards capitalism, socialism, communism, and everything else, the group that was most hostile to capitalism were Hispanics, more hostile, had a more negative view of capitalism than did self-identified supporters of Occupy Wall Street, more than self-identified supporters who said that they were liberal Democrats, quote unquote. The group that most supports Obamacare, it's close, is probably Hispanics. It might be African American, but you're looking at roughly two-thirds saying they have a favorable and support that bill view of it. The group most in favor of gun control in America appears to be Hispanic Americans, and I could go on and on.
Yeah. I think it's political. This week Monday talked about this mega GOP donor Paul Singer making a six-figure donation to a group that's involved in marshaling conservatives to support an overhaul on our federal laws on this issue. I mean, is there? It sounds like there's tons of pressure that's going on legislators at this time. Right.
Well, it's what did Lenin, the leader of the Soviet Revolution, say? There's a lot of the capitalists will sell you the rope to hang him. Well, there's just and he also talked about the concept of useful idiots. These are people who help you inadvertently with your revolution. Well, that's kind of a harsh statement, but the reality is there are lots of conservatives who've never actually looked at the voting data, who had no idea of the political preferences of the people that they're trying to turn into voters. And so when you press them on this, a lot of times they'll say, well, I didn't know, or we'll fix that. Somehow we'll change their minds, as if they were malleable pieces of clay and not human beings entitled to their own opinions. The fact is, if immigration continues, the United States politically will continue to move in a more left or progressive direction. That's not necessarily bad or good, but it is a fact, because the new immigrants and their children, based on all the polling data we have, tend to favor expansive government. Again, in a democracy, you change the voters, the political system has to respond. That's just the reality of the situation. I mean, we've seen it in the past. When my family came to the United States, particularly the children of the Great Wave, say 1880 to 1920, they helped make the New Deal possible, those voters.
Dr. Stephen Camarota is our guest. Folks, after the break, we're going to find out how imminent this matter is in the Senate and the House. And if you'd like to get on board, you can pick up your phone right now and call us at 800-733-9829. The lines are open, 800-733-9829. You're listening to Crosstalk.
Technology continues to expand the ways we can send and receive audio files, and the Crosstalk program is no exception. The most current way to hear Crosstalk is live at 2 p.m. Central, repeated at 8 p.m. Central on the VCY America network, or on the internet at crosstalkamerica.com or from Shoutcast. There are MP3 files of the most recent programs available at crosstalkamerica.com. But sometimes it makes more sense to have a program on CD to listen again, or to give to a friend or relative, or even to play for a church gathering. Order Crosstalk CDs for a donation of $6 each by calling 1-800-729-9829. Just mention the date or dates of the programs you need. Or mail your request to VCY Tape Ministry,
3434 West Kilbourne Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin 53208. And again, that phone number for Crosstalk CDs is 1-800-729-9829. That's toll free, 1-800-729-9829.
You're listening to Crosstalk here on the VCY America Network. Dr. Stephen Camarota is with us today from the Center for Immigration Studies. Folks, a little bit more information before we pick up your phone calls here. And one of the questions I had, if we give this amnesty, you mentioned 11 million here in the country illegally, won't this just open the doors saying, hey, come here, just encourage more people to enter our country illegally?
That's a very fair question. We did have an amnesty back in '86. We gave legal status to 2.7 million illegal immigrants, and today we have upwards of 10 to 12 million. It certainly didn't work in the past. It does seem to have encouraged more people to come, and one would guess the current amnesty would do the same thing. You might as well get in line for it because we certainly have a precedent.
And what about if we set this law into place, and I know some of the rules and everything have to be drafted yet, and this so-called, this plan from the Department of Homeland Security, are there enforcement mechanisms in this legislation?
Yes, and surprisingly, they're spectacularly weak. Let me just give you a few. Everyone agrees we're going to have a verification system that requires employers to verify the legal status of new immigrants, of new workers, that they're legally entitled to work in the United States. We have a system in place. It works already. Employers use it voluntarily, like it a lot. It's called E-Verify. Now, this bill does not require the use of E-Verify for 5 years. In other words, we don't begin even when the bill goes into effect, it's 5 years later until E-Verify actually goes into effect. But it's worse than that. It never applies to existing workers.
Oh, my.
So it only applies to new hires. On the border, only 3 of the 9 sectors are required to be secured. These are supposed to be the most trafficked sectors. But the other 6, well, they're not going to be, I guess, secured. It goes on and on.
Yeah, just follow
this. One more outrage.
Just follow the signs to the detour, and we'll show you, another crossing.
Let me give you another outrage. There's a confidentiality provision. So let's say you apply, but it turns out you're a previously deported murderer trying to apply under another name, but the system does find you out. It turns you down. A, the bill does not require them to go get you, and B, the bill prevents law enforcement from using any information that you provided in your application, such as your address, your place of employment, to go pick you up. They can't go use any of that against you. So you're not only does the bill not make the people who are rejected leave, but it makes it very hard to go get them because we can't use any of the information that they gave us, even though it's a fraudulent application because you said your name was X, but it was really something else, and you lied about not having a criminal record. You committed explicit fraud. We still cannot use that information to go after you. That's how this system works. So I think that, and there are other aspects of the enforcement regime that are weak as well. But I think that what is surprising is they didn't even have a fig leaf of strong enforcement in here. I mean, just to give you another example, we think 40% of illegal immigrants are people who overstayed a temporary visa. As I said before, they came in as a student or a guest worker, and then they never went home. But you would need an entry-exit system, recording the arrival and departure of people to deter that sort of thing, because you'd know whether the time limits had been honored. Well, this bill never creates it. It only does it at airports. The land borders, where most temporary visitors come in and out, are exempt. We're not going to have an entry-exit system there. That's how bad this bill is. And there are other examples, but I'll cut it off there.
Well, and then when you couple this with what this nation has just gone through, I mean, just within the last, couple hours, there were 3 more arrests made in connection with the Boston bombing, and 3 roommates of the younger Sarnoff brother, and come to find out that they were going to be brought in on immigration violation issues. We've got to clamp down on this issue. I mean, there's no ifs, ands, or buts. Dr. Camarota, for when we look at this legislation, how imminent is this matter in the Senate? How imminent is it in the House?
Well, the Hewitt's markup is coming now, so they'll have a vote soon in the subcommittee. Since the Democrats dominate the committee, I should say, the Judiciary, will vote this out onto the floor. And so probably in about 3-4 weeks, the bill will be actively debated in the Senate, though the first hurdle is in Judiciary, which it's likely to pass sometime in the next 2 weeks there. Maybe, and then maybe 4 or 5 weeks it'll be on the House floor. Then it has to go over, the Senate floor. Then it has to go over to the House. The bottom line is, if you like the bill or hate it, the thing that will really propel it or prevent it is phone calls, faxing, email. Get online with your member, get online with your senator, and tell them what you think. And if you don't like it, you got to tell them. And if you do it constantly, and a lot of people do it, the Senate will back off. Although there's an enormous amount of money and power behind this bill, in the end, voters do matter. I can tell you, I've been working up on Capitol Hill for much of my professional life. If they hear from people, the thing will not pass. But if they don't hear from people, and all they hear from is the interest groups, it will pass. So it's really kind of up to your listeners.
Folks, here is the phone number. Again, you know the number to the Senate switchboard, 202-224-3121. 202-224-3121. I'd like to also give you Senator Marco Rubio's number because he has been perhaps one of the leaders of this Gang of Eight as far as proposing this and promoting it. His number, 202-224-3041. 202-224-3041. Your House member is 202-225-3121. And if you'd like direct numbers to their offices, Senate.gov, House.gov will provide that information for you. Let's get to the phone lines. Terry, thanks for your patience from Chattanooga, Tennessee. You're on the air.
Hey, I really appreciate this program today, and I really almost hate to break in because Dr. Camarota was doing such a good job. And I'd just like to emphasize what he just said. This happened in 2007, and we just called, and they were stunned at how many people were so opposed to it. And the Democrats as well as the Republicans will back off. But there's one thing that I would like to say that he kind of hit all around it, and that is that for years, I've been kindly involved in this for a long time, and for years we have been trying to force them to enforce our laws, and they just refuse to do it. We've got laws in the books that would have prevented all this and taken care of it, and they've just refused it. And to suggest that we're going to have a new law that somehow they're going to decide they will enforce this one, there's absolutely no evidence that they will change their actions.
Good point. I appreciate you raising that, Terry. As we take a look at this, Stephen, I mean, the problem is now we're not enforcing the law. How are we to believe that they're going to enforce this new law?
You shouldn't. Let me give a substantive example. 5 previous times Congress has passed a law requiring the creation of an entry-exit system. This bill would be the 6th time. And we still don't have it. What makes this, I guess, 6 times is the charm or something. It's absurd. It's ridiculous to think that the law is going to be enforced now when it hasn't for so long in the past.
Let's go to Loves Park, Illinois. Sue, you're on the air. Hello, Sue.
Hi. I'd just like to say I live in Loves Park, Illinois, which is just right by Rockford. We have the highest unemployment rate along with Belvedere and Freeport, Rockford, in the state, and probably one of the highest unemployment rates in the country. What has happened is businesses have withdrawn from Illinois because of the high taxes. People downsize to jobs that I'm qualified for. I have my degree in computers. I can't get a job in that, so I'm going out looking for jobs that a lot of illegals are taking because they won't hire me, and I just don't think that that's fair. And I don't think that Dick Durbin is going to, race to Illinois to try and fix our economy because he hasn't done anything for Rockford in the past, and I doubt that he'll do anything in the future.
It's funny that you mentioned Senator Durbin, because I testified before the committee that he's on Judiciary just last week. The funny thing is, in that committee room was the only place in America where everybody talked about a labor shortage. We don't have enough workers. There's nobody to do our jobs. And yet every single statistic, which I won't, I've given too many already, that the government has on wages, employment, unemployment, U6 unemployment, U3 unemployment, I could go through the list, but I won't, shows that we have a superabundance of workers. There is no labor shortage. Americans are really hurting. And yet, in the Senate room, everyone talked about a need for more workers and a labor shortage. And here's the kicker. This bill doesn't just amnesty 11 million illegal immigrants. Perhaps even more importantly, it doubles future legal immigration from 1 million green cards a year to 2 million green cards a year for the next 10 years. And on top of that, it creates a lot of new guest worker programs, which I won't even go into, at a time of record rates of non-work in this country and significant declines in wages, especially at the bottom end of the labor market. It is entirely out of touch with the reality Americans face.
So, Sue, the problem's about to get worse.
But, Sue, I would tell you that if you call both your senators and inform them, just help them understand what's going on and do so repeatedly and get your friends, it will make a difference. Even if it doesn't change their vote, it makes them push less enthusiastically. And at the same time, when other members say, I can't vote for this, they're heard much more sympathetically by someone like Durbin, who isn't going to probably change his mind, but at least he'll hear other people because he's like, hey, I'm getting those phone calls too. I understand you can't support the amnesty and the big increases in legal immigration.
Sue,
so
thanks.
Your call does matter.
Thank you, Sue. Mauston, Wisconsin. Mason, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Couple of points. One, why don't we, the states, do what that one sheriff does? He's got this tent city. Why don't we, the states, round up these illegal aliens, work them for nothing in a tent city, confiscate anything they got, cars, guns, clothes, pots and pans, sell it in an auction, and turn around and send their illegal children back home. And then if you want to do a law, then why don't we just do a reciprocating law, if you understand what I mean? And I'll get off the phone. A reciprocating law would be one, we follow the laws of the country in which that person comes from under immigration.
Stephen?
Well, very briefly, let me tell you what this law does. It bars the states explicitly from doing just about any kind of enforcement now. There's an ambiguous area, and the Supreme Court's been asked to weigh in because Congress won't define it as it should. And so what happens is the Supreme Court just says, well, the states can do some enforcement, but not other types of enforcement. But this law sort of settles the question. If this thing passes, states will basically prohibit it from enforcing immigration law. This will settle that. And so that's another aspect of how this thing is so weak or guts what enforcement there is.
Let's go to Twin Falls, Idaho. Chris, thank you for calling Crosstalk. You're on the air.
Hi. I have a different take on this whole immigration thing, so forgive my rabbit trail. My wife and I are both blind, grew up, learning Braille, doing the whole shot. She's presently working. I'm retired early from a job in Washington State before we relocated here. The reason I'm calling you is to throw a different spin on everything you've talked about. You've been talking about immigration. You've talked about folks of color. It happens that both of us are white. That doesn't really matter. But what I wanted to tell you all and your audience is that there are 70% of working-age blind people in this country who are unemployed, and this statistic has been around for probably 25, 30 years, and no one is interested in that idea. You've got rehab agencies for folks with disabilities and people that are blind, and it's worse now than it ever was when I was young, and I'm 60 years old, so I just thought you ought to know that.
Thank you, Chris, for sharing that, and will that problem grow worse? We'll be back in 60 seconds. You're listening to Crosstalk. For
For the Worldview Weekend Minute, I'm Brandon House. Our website's worldviewweekend.com. We're continuing our series on a biblical worldview and money, 20 points. We're on point number 8 today. A wise man does not trust in riches. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 17 speaks to this. Now, as we've explained, there's nothing wrong with money or having money. It's really neutral. It's not money that's the root of all evil. It's the love of money. And we don't place our trust in our money. We place our trust in the Lord Jesus Christ alone. Number 9, a wise man understands that real money is gold and silver, and God owns it all. Haggai 2, verse 8 speaks to this. A wise man understands that real money is something that has intrinsic value, not a fiat paper currency that can be inflated at the whim of the politicians and the central bankers. So a godly man or a wise man understands what is of real value, what's a real hard asset, and they have diversification. The Bible speaks to that as well. We'll continue on our next program.
Folks, the more you hear about this so-called compromise legislation from the Gang of Eight, the more concerning it becomes. We're speaking today with Dr. Stephen Camarota, Director of Research for the Center for Immigration Studies. And just before going back to our calls, you have a website that we have just scratched the surface on this issue, but you've got a lot of material on your website. Tell us about the site that is available to our listeners.
It's CIS.org. So CIS, like Center for Immigration Studies, abbreviated .org. And everything there is free, and you can download it.
To Tomah, Wisconsin, let's go. And James is calling. Go ahead, James, you're on the air.
Thank you for taking my call. I have a number of things to point out. Number one, this is more than just a leftward turning of the vote. This is part and parcel of the Cloward-Piven strategy for toppling a sovereign nation by overloading its systems. It also reminds us of Hitler's strategy in Czechoslovakia, where he demanded cession of land due to a majority of the German population on that land. It also throws open the floodgates for more illegal immigration, including most likely terrorists. And while we're so busy falling over ourselves trying to accommodate these people who have broken our laws to get in our doors, what about our homeschool refugees that the Obama administration wants to deport?
The Romeike family, yeah.
I mean, yeah. Without going, that's a very, that's a one case, and I'm usually big picture. But it seems outrageous to me. Mm-hmm. How can they grant amnesty in the way they do, and refugee asylum so quickly, and yet in this case, where it seems perfectly reasonable, they don't. Yeah. But anyway, look, we don't want to have some kind of radical conspiracy idea here. It is true that people on the left get it. That as long as legal immigration, forget about illegal immigration, stays high, it's a great deal for the Democrats. In general, the legal immigrants break 2-to-1 in favor of Democrats. They tend to be liberal. As far as we can tell, this is true of Hispanic immigrants, Asian immigrants, and the modest number of European immigrants. Basically, they all come from countries where the state plays a more active role. And so they come here, and they tend to support that. Not everyone. That's just a generalization. But it looks to be about 2-to-1. That's why if we continue the high levels of legal immigration that we have now, over 1 million a year, forget about illegal immigration. Legal immigration has a transformative effect on the national electorate, shifting it towards the Democrats. But this bill doubles legal immigration from about 1 million a year in the future to at least 2 million for the next decade. About 20 million will arrive, in addition to the 11 million who get amnesties. So stakes couldn't be higher, and the fact that the Republican leadership supports it, it leaves one to say, haven't they ever looked at a poll? Don't they know what all the research shows? The answer seems to be either they're so in bed, if you will, with corporate interests, or they just don't know. Or don't care.
We're going to squeeze in our next call from Pensacola, Florida. And, Michael, you're on the air.
Yes, sir. This is a statement I want to make. Let's suppose that Mexico discovered they have vast quantities of gold all of a sudden. Do you think the borders get shut down then? And if I try to cross over, will I be shot on the spot?
Well, I mean, the short answer is Mexico has a border with Guatemala where illegal immigration is a problem, and they are extremely harsh. The abuse that they heap on anybody who tries to illegally enter their country or stay in their country is enormous. And I'm not suggesting that we behave the way the Mexicans do towards illegal immigrants, but it is the height of hypocrisy for them to criticize us.
Good point. Thank you, Michael. And let's pick up one further call. Marion, Indiana. Nancy, you're on the air.
Well, hi. I got or listened in kind of late, so I can't be certain what all you've covered. But what I did want to bring out was that our lax Mexican border has been addressed and compared to the 1800s Irish potato famine, because Jesuits were behind both. In that, in the Irish potato famine, the people were on purpose starved to death, so they had to leave, and they were funneled here so that there would be more control here by the Pope. So he had Catholics to vote how he wanted.
Okay, so bring that to present, Nancy. What is your thought there?
I don't know, because I was listening. I mean, I don't know what you were trying to point out earlier, because I got in on late.
I mean, let me say this. I think you should not think of this as any kind of conspiracy. It is the case that as just a general matter, high levels of legal immigration, and this bill will supercharge that, shift the political balance towards the Democratic Party, because the people who arrive, all the available evidence suggests, are more sympathetic to larger government and regulation and higher taxes and so forth. And in the democracy, the government has to represent the will of the people and what people want. And if you change the people, then the government must, in a democracy, change accordingly. This is not, however, some left-wing conspiracy per se. Yes, progressives in the left get it. It's a good deal for them. But that's not, I mean, it's not the case that that's some kind of conscious thing. And remember, conservatives, including business interests, have gone along with this for years. So it isn't as if this is something that's being snuck in or something that we're not aware of. The reality is that this is a choice we're making to create a much more politically progressive country, if you like. We don't have to continue to do that, but and this bill supercharges that process. So the question is that what the American people want?
Folks, again, the telephone numbers to your senator, 202-224-3121, 224-3121. Again, perhaps the one that has been very vocal in promoting this, Marco Rubio, 202-224-3041. 202-224-3041. On the House side, 202-225-3121. Take about half a minute, if you would, Stephen. I know we heard reports leading up to the sequester that many illegals were released from the detainment process due to the cost of keeping them, putting them through the system, etc. Any update at what's happening there?
Well, we do know that this bill allows people who've even previously been deported to reapply to come back in.
Oh my.
As far as that, not all the people, as my understanding, who were criminals, serious criminals, who were released were actually were found and were grabbed back up. So, we have released criminals, and we haven't found them all.
So previously deported people can come back?
Yeah, now, it have to have been in the last few years. But, yes, if you've been deported and you're out of the country, you can apply at the border or at your consulate to re-enter the United States under this bill.
Dr. Stephen Camarota has been our guest here today on Crosstalk. Their website, CIS.org. That stands for the Center for Immigration Studies, CIS.org. Dr. Camarota, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Keeping you informed, folks. This is Crosstalk on VCY America. Thanks for joining us.
You've been listening to Crosstalk via satellite and the internet from VCY America. Views expressed may or may not be those of this station. For a CD of today's program, send a donation of $6 or more to VCY Take Ministry, 3434 West Kilbourne Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 53208. Or download by RSS or podcast from crosstalkamerica.com. And join us again for Crosstalk.